we are here today to really wrestle with our country's most central and most painful problem, which is how to build real equity in both senses of that word, given our racial past and our racial present. Because as we all know, this divide has been with our country since the founding. In 1903, W.E.B. Du Bois said that, quote, "To be a poor race in a land of dollars is the very bottom." And just last month, in a column that really caught my eye, the conservative columnist David Brooks called the racial divide, quote, "our original sin, which hardens the heart." So this racial divide is something that all Americans on both sides of the aisle feel. Some of us work with it, try to make healing the divide central to our day-to-day, and some of us wish it away. Try to suppress it, but I would say that there is not a single American, Black, white, Asian, Latinx, Native, there is not a single one of us who isn't acutely aware that our racial divide hurts each of us. So, our question today is, what can philanthropy do? And to me, that means, what can people with access and influence and power and capital do to bring us closer to pragmatic solutions to healing this 350-year-old divide? So I'm going to get to the pragmatic and to the philanthropy part at the end of this, but I'm going to spend most of my time in this quickly cobbled together keynote suggesting that a few big myths, really a few big conceptual errors, get in the way of our ability to get to real solutions. So I think there are three myths. The first is that the free market exists and as such is efficient and effective and brings good things to all people at low prices if it's left to its own devices. And therefore, free markets are the best way to allow more people to benefit economically, and that though we have problems, those problems should be solved first by looking at market solutions or sort of market-based solutions. That's the first myth. I think the second myth is that government is bureaucratic and inefficient and bad at solving problems. That's the second myth. And the third, which I know is a lot of what we've discussed today, is that we can fix our economic problems over here and then our equity problems separately. So it's like fixing the economy and something called civil rights can be dealt with in different silos or different buckets by different people. And of course, we all share values, and that's terrific, but really these are separate things to deal with. And I think that is perhaps the most pernicious myth. And moving from these myths to new realities is what I think our transformative moment is all about. I would also submit that we are living through a moment unlike any moment that any of us have lived in our professional lives and our political lives, because we're at a moment where all these myths are being questioned. And I further think that we can only move past them to tell a different story about how our economy works. If we are affirmative about inclusion, and if and when we can move to that, the story we tell ourselves about our economy, then we can live in a very different and actually a much better America. Now, I believe this for a couple of reasons. The first has to do with the data. I mean, the Roosevelt Institute is a think tank. We publish a lot of white papers about a lot of data, with a lot of data about corporate concentration and market wages and unemployment and underemployment and the role of corporate governance. And I am here to tell you, without boring you with all the data, I am here to tell you that the data is absolutely clear that the economy that we have created for ourselves over the last 50 years is not working the way it was intended to. So part of the reason I believe we're at this moment, this kind of tipping point, has to do with the data. But the second reason has to do with my family. So I mean, if you'll indulge me, I'm going to take a little bit of time to tell you about sort of who I am and where I come from. I'm a second-generation Californian, and I'm a child of 1970s Sunnyvale. 1970s Sunnyvale is not anything like 2019 Sunnyvale, but we'll get to that. My parents were born in the United States shortly after their parents landed at Angel Island in the 1930s. My grandparents traveled separately because the Chinese Exclusion Act said that husbands and wives are not allowed to be together in the United States. The explicit and very racialized fear that was clear in that act was that Chinese laborers who were brought over to build railroads and dig mines and dig canals, that Chinese laborers would actually stay and start families, and that was not something that American legislators, the American government at that point wanted. So my grandmothers were both paper daughters, which means that they were undocumented. And, you know, in this environment, my parents grew up in Oakland's Chinatown in the 1940s. They went to public school. They attended UC Berkeley because it was the closest school to my mom's family restaurant, and it was the closest school to my dad's family corner store. And Berkeley charged them an incidental fee of $84 annually. And so, you know, they got married, they fell in love, they got married, they bought a tract house in Sunnyvale, California, today's Silicon Valley. That tract house is 1.5 miles from the Apple campus, and they bought it in 1961 for $21,000. They still live there. My mom was a public school teacher. My dad was an engineer at a large contractor that basically did most of its work for the Defense Department. So again, government contracting. So we were part of the California dream of the 1950s and the 1960s. That dream, in Manuel Pastor's words, if any of you know Manuel Pastor from USC, who wrote a lot about this period. He and I sort of grew up with similar stories. But anyway, Manuel has said that that California dream was, quote, a commitment to create platforms of opportunity for both those who are already living in the Golden State and those who are still to come. What made that dream possible was government. Government provided a foundation, it provided a floor for my immigrant family to succeed. And the story is that in 1959, Governor Pat Brown, which is former Governor Jerry Brown's dad, some of you might remember the Brown family legacy, but anyway, Governor Brown in 1959 signed a slew of bills during his first legislative session. They were all funded by the biggest tax increase, and pro-taxes, by the way, the biggest tax increase that the state had seen in decades. And the state invested in physical infrastructure, such as the California Water Plan and the California Freeway System. On some of these things, we may know better now about how to build infrastructure, but nonetheless, both of these things were backbones, or we may not know better. That's obviously a national conversation. But at any rate, these were backbones of suburban growth, and also through the very Governor Brown pushed through the famed California Master Plan for higher education, which built the University of California, Berkeley, UCLA, but also Santa Barbara, San Diego, Santa Cruz, Irvine, right? The master plan also built the California State University system and the California Community College system. They envisioned all of these things at the same time, all of these levels of education from world-class research universities to community colleges, and this was a blanket commitment to the state's young people. If you wanted a college education, even if your parents were undocumented and you basically lived, as my father did, in a single room with 5 other siblings, if you wanted a college education and you were that kid, you could get it. Now, I talk about this history not because California is perfect. It is far from perfect. But California today is the world's 5th largest economy, and it is the nation's largest state. And despite the fact that it also had a long history of veering away from government and towards neoliberal tax cutting, it's the home of Richard Nixon and Ronald Reagan, of course, who both drove that agenda. But despite that, I believe that the foundation of California's growth even today does remain government. And also today, California has a truly multiracial democracy where people of color run for office, they hold real power, and of course some of our presidential candidates today are office holders. Kamala Harris is a woman of color who got her political start in California. So to me, the story of my home state and my family illustrates the economic importance of government commitment to government services for all people. So that is part of the reason that I believe that some of what we say about free markets and government are myths. The work of the Roosevelt Institute really focuses on the idea that rules and institutions shape the world around us. I think that to understand my story and to understand the story of America, you have to understand how rules shape outcomes. And the myth that rules don't really matter and that markets are free from rules is what holds us back. So that was actually myth number one. The reality, so now I'm going to go through the three myths and try to counter them for you a little bit, because the reality, contra myth number one, is that markets exist and they are structured in ways that can either provide more people more or few or less. Markets are structured based on rules. The economy is not an impersonal set of forces governed by the natural laws of supply and demand. That's not to say that supply and demand don't exist or don't matter, and that's not even to say that markets don't exist or don't matter. It's just to say that how markets work are determined by the rules that we write. Now, this is true for businesses. Corporations exist as a matter of law, and the privileges that we grant to them, for example, the right to perpetual existence, or the right to protect their investors from personal liability and bankruptcy, these are actually privileges that are granted by government with the idea that corporations should, in exchange, provide some kind of public benefit. So that's just one set of rules, actually, that structures our markets. Or think about the rules of the labor market. We write rules to say who gets to participate. And for most of our nation's history, this is obviously quite well known, but it bears repeating here, that the answer to who could participate in our nation's labor market was basically white men of a certain age. These were the only people who could actually get legitimate wage labor. It's also true, of course, that white men of a certain age were the only ones who were fully able to accumulate and pass on to their heirs capital, which gets to the wealth question that we all are talking about here today and that you all work on a daily basis. And so these quite simple rules actually have had profound consequences, and they have determined in our society who has power and who doesn't, and who has wealth and who doesn't. And I would submit that these rules are actually the underlying driver of wealth creation and the reason for our yawning racial wealth gap, which I know we've talked about today and that many of you work on. These rules are the reason that white households have 10 times the amount of wealth that similarly situated, similarly educationally situated black households do. And that is because wealth begets wealth. And wealth is actually more than sort of dollars and cents. I would say that wealth is a kind of crystallized history. So that's the first myth that I think is worth uncovering. The second myth is that government is bad at solving problems. But the reality is that government is actually better at some things than the private sector. It's better at access. It's actually better at making sure that equity is real and that all people have access to the building blocks of a dignified life: healthcare, housing, education. Government is also better than the private sector at during times of economic transformation, which is what we are obviously living through right now with the transformation to the digital economy and the deep, deep, deep threat of climate change. Government is better at making sure that our society can meet the moment. The market just will not do enough fast enough to get us there. Now, one very clear example of this, and something that's come up in contemporary politics recently, of course, is the New Deal. You knew I had to go there because Roosevelt Institute, we're actually for real, the Roosevelt Institute, like I have 5 Roosevelts on my board, like, so we are actually directly of that lineage and legacy. But anyway, but I'm not saying this just because it's, my professional obligation. It's actually, the history bears this out, because over the course of his presidency, Franklin Roosevelt launched over 100, this is like almost inconceivable today, if you think about it. He launched over 100 federal programs and agencies. Now, some are kind of lost to the mists of time. I look at them wistfully occasionally, the Federal Writers Project. That'd be so cool. Anyway, the National Recovery Act, which is maybe, I don't look at so wistfully, but there's a lot of lessons to be learned from that. But some of those agencies and rules and programs really remain. The obvious one is Social Security. But the result of Roosevelt's actions were profound, right? Billions spent at the height of the Depression to prevent home and farm foreclosure, the federal regulation of Wall Street finance, the revitalization of the antitrust division at the Department of Justice, huge public works spending from the Civilian Conservation Corps to the Tennessee Valley Authority to the Rural Electrification Corporation. And of course, at the end of his presidency, Roosevelt oversaw a wartime mobilization whereby 17 million new jobs were created, industrial productivity almost doubled, and entire industries were created based on government spending and government demand. So let's not pretend that Roosevelt was perfect. New Deal exclusions of women and people of color from Social Security and the National Labor Relations Act, redlining, which kept African American families from owning homes with solid 30-year mortgages. We know this. We at the Roosevelt Institute know this, and we know that these things have had pernicious racial wealth effects. But I would submit that today, if we think really hard and really creatively about government, we have a chance to mobilize government for the better. And then finally, myth 3, which is the idea that we can solve economic problems first and solve for equity at some point later or in a different place. This is actually something that I hear good progressives say all the time. This was behind the identity politics argument that we had right after the election, this idea that Hillary lost because she didn't pay enough attention to the economics and instead pandered to these identity groups. That argument is actually wrong in more ways than we possibly have time for today. But it's important to note it here because it's simply wrong to say that it's wrong because, for a very basic reason. Our economy was constituted by exclusion. Obviously slavery. Obviously Jim Crow. The Chinese Exclusion Act. The GI Bill that famously built the American middle class, but did it in ways that were very racialized. Just to take one example, in 1946 in Mississippi, employment services matched 86% of skilled jobs to white returning GIs and 92% of unskilled jobs to returning black veterans. So you had a GI Bill, it was just applying these rules quite differently. So what I'm here to say is that you have to fix both of these things at the same time, and I'm sure that that's what Angela Glover Blackwell would have said. In every economic policy we pursue, we ought to design them to make sure that they work for the most vulnerable first, straightforwardly and directly, because this is the only way, given a 350-year history of exclusion, affirmative inclusion is the only way to make real progress. So, to conclude, I've been asked to, and it's always daunting, for somebody who runs a nonprofit to say, well, you just give the philanthropic community a few challenges, throw it out there. But I'm going to do my best to try, because I think all of the myths that I outlined do really matter to the philanthropy conversation that you're having today. That's because of this crazy moment that we're living in. Political candidates and the press alike are shining a light on the rules and imbalances in our markets like never before, and this narrative is just on the cusp of moving. I'm about to publish actually a public opinion paper that really shows that we are evenly divided between Americans who believe the bootstraps narrative, that you get essentially what you deserve, and if you're poor because you don't work hard enough and you're rich because you work very hard, we're very evenly divided. Actually, slightly less than half of Americans believe that, and slightly less of half of Americans believe the idea that the economy's structure determines wealth or poverty. So we're at this moment where different and new ways of building wealth and assets, like baby bonds or even reparations for Americans of African descent, these ideas have been discussed kind of on the fringes for years, but they're now central to the conversation. So in this moment, right, what is my challenge as a grant seeker? What is my challenge to philanthropy? I've got just a few. First, I would say you should consider the organizations out there that are led by new EDs. We were just talking about Spencer Overton over here. But there are many organizations that are led by new EDs and new CEOs, often people of color, and these are folks working on changing the rules. These are folks who and organizations who privilege solutions that always center the most vulnerable, and many of my colleagues are running groups like this, and I would say that these are the groups to really watch. The second thing I would say is that you should consider long-term support in favor of these leaders. I would bet on these leaders. These are my friends, these are my colleagues. I would definitely do that. The third thing I would say is you should consider funding collaborations amongst them and realize that because this really is a movement, but funding collaboration, you all know this, but it's just worth saying, it means more money so that organizations can really do work together well. And then the last thing I'd say, and I heard this in the morning conversation, but you should consider the ways in which metrics and project support either do or don't get you to the kind of equity outcomes you really want. Because rule change and narrative change, these things are really hard. This is what we do at the Roosevelt Institute, but these things are really hard to measure year over year or quarter over quarter. You can get impact and you can measure it, but it's really hard to do it in a really deeply metrics-driven way. So I will wrap up by saying that for many years, I was actually a funder. I represented individual donors, and so I know the enormity of the challenge that's before you and that I've put before you. I know what it's like to be in institutions. I actually represented 120 live donors, so you can think about what that might mean as you think about your day jobs. But anyway, but I would also say to you as somebody who now sits on the other side of the table, this is a moment to bet on people and leaders who are pushing hard for rules change. Now, you might not agree with the rules changes that I just argued for. You might actually vehemently disagree with them. But I would say that you should be supporting the organizations and the leaders who are pushing for the rules change that you believe in, because in this moment, you'll be pushing on an open door, and this is the only way to get the kind of change that, as Americans, I believe we deserve. Thank you.